To kick us off today, we have the privilege of learning and listening to Simon Starkey and Alex Barron. Simon's a distinguished expert in creating purpose-driven profit maximization solutions within the veterinary profession. So we're confident that today, Simon's insights will offer some significant benefits to your practice. I think there's going to be some engaging discussions. With all of that, I would ask during the presentation, if we can just hit the mute button, just to avoid any unwanted noises or distractions. We are going to record this, and we'll toss it up on our social and a couple other platforms, just if you want to reference back to it. As for questions, there will be a Q&A period. We're going to hold that till the end, though. So if you want to ask a question, maybe just toss it in the comments, and then certainly Simon and Alex will address it towards the end of this presentation. We're going to keep to about 45 to an hour. So with that, Simon, Alex, we'll turn this over to you.
Well, thanks so much, everybody. Just a quick intro before I jump into the slides. So I'm Simon Starkey, Australian-trained veterinarian. I've been focusing more and more in the last couple of years on helping private practices optimize their pricing strategy. And as we'll see in the presentation, it grew out of kind of my training and experience over the past really 20 years in the US vet industry. I'm joined by my employee number one, Alex Barron. He's going to help sort of moderate, really just keep an eye on those questions in the chat and help me at the end just kind of engage and make sure we've answered your questions. I'm just going to switch over momentarily and share the screen, and we'll get started in just a second on the presentation proper.
So I'm going to do this every first week of the month, Friday for each month, just different things.
Okay. Is that coming through, everybody? All right, wonderful. Well, thanks for joining us. So today's topic is veterinary market trends and pricing strategies for 2024. I'm going to focus a little more on the pricing strategies than the market trends, but we will touch on that just a little bit to get a sense, at least of the macro picture at the moment. So I represent my own boutique consulting firm, Marquis Practice Solutions LLC, and we're just going to cover a quick overview here of what we're going to talk about today. So a brief personal introduction, get a sense of who's speaking to you today, where I'm coming from, a little bit of US economic picture. Now, I'm not an economist. I have an interest in it, certainly keep up on the financial news quite frequently, and I just want to share a general sense of where things seem to be going. Talk a little bit about Marquis Practice Solutions, the history and the background, and really that's to say, why did I start doing this and how could it be applicable and relevant to your practices? And then really the meat, the substance here is going to be a couple of examples straight from the field, some of my consulting work that I think will be applicable and potentially beneficial to you as of today. So as for the background, you can probably hear my Southern accent, it's a Southern Hemisphere accent. So got my bachelor's in veterinary medicine from the University of Sydney, went on, got a PhD at Cornell in epidemiology, and that helps drive actually quite a lot of my analytics today, not looking at infectious diseases in animals, but it's still quite applicable. Got a residency and board certified in avian medicine, came back about a decade later and got an MBA. Clinically, just relevant for you guys to know that I do know what it's like out in the field as well. A couple of years of specialty practice beyond the 2-year residency, about 5 years of full-time and 3 years part-time general practice, predominantly canine feline with some exotics in there. Some corporate work. I spent 5 years embedded in PetSmart's headquarters, so not with Banfield out in the field, but actually right there in the thick of things in Phoenix. Several years of government practice, so full disclosure, I still do have a day job with the New York State Department of Health. That's 37.5 hours a week, so you guys know that's kind of part-time for a veterinarian. So Alex and myself were able to service a number of clients, and we cap it quite intentionally. We never serve more than 3 at a time to make sure we can do a good job. And the business has been going about a year now. Let's dive into the economic trends, and you could be forgiven for getting whiplash as you look at these news feeds coming in. Google and Apple News know me pretty well, and they tend to serve a lot of these stories up. And this one is from October of last year, not that long ago. We're seeing saving rates fall. They had initially done fairly well in the early pandemic due to stimulus checks and generous unemployment that many states offered. But what you see is, as you see savings rate fall, the opposite side of that coin, of course, is that credit card debt is going to increase. And this story keeps coming really every month they issue the data, it gets to a record high. And so that's something I'm saying, let's be a little bit cautious about here. Your consumers, your customers are probably having less money in savings and more of a balance on their credit cards going forward. So perhaps a little bit of caution is warranted there. Now, the good news, I do like to share good news, is that we've had a positive consumer sentiment, the biggest 2-month gain since 1991. So going back quite a ways. So this is good news. This is fairly hot off the press here, coming out in late January. And similarly, good news was Q4 GDP estimates. So the national gross domestic product was rounded up as well and exceeded expectations. So net, I'll say I'm seeing a lot more positive news come into the feed. You may have heard a lot about this sort of hard landing, soft landing. We got all the way through 2023 without a hard landing. At one point, Bloomberg News had it at 100% likely. So I sort of recently did a post saying, well, if we didn't have a hard landing, have we actually had a soft landing already? Important point here, these things are often nuanced, and Axios does a great job of putting out fairly quick, easily readable financial and business news. And here's an interesting one. That underlying picture of the consumer sentiment is quite dichotomous. So we have those making over 100,000 are pretty happy. They're getting well into the positive sentiment territory. Now we're seeing the exact same trend here among lower income earners, but they're ways off, especially under 50,000. But even 50 to 100, they're not feeling anywhere near as good as the 100 plus. And of course, that 100 plus can go way higher. So it's important here. The main take home is just be cognizant of your clients. I'm sure you are better than anybody else, but they may not always be doing as well as we are, or as well as other segments of the population. So something to keep in mind and keep an eye on going forwards. So let's dive into kind of the origins of the business, and hopefully you'll see why this is relevant. One of my favorite catchphrases, and it's not really mine, it came from a senior vice president at PetSmart, and that is, top line is vanity, bottom line is sanity. A lot of friends in the business and more clients now, and they often speak to me about their gross margins, gross revenue, sorry. Oh, I had an 8K day, a 10K day. That is wonderful. But it's better to have a $5,000 day and keep 2,000 than a $10,000 day and keep 1,000. And so that's where the sanity piece comes in there. I'm not going to dwell too much on these accounting terms and figures here, but do want to set some definitions that will be important as we dig into this. And again, the main reason is, yes, revenue, top line growth is important. You obviously need that. But really, how much you're keeping at the end of the day is more important. And so revenue is a function of how much you sell at the average cost. In this case, I've put average unit retail, but the average cost times the total number of units. The gross margin, so those practices that do start to dig a little bit, look at the margin, they tend to look at how much did I make and then what were my COGS. But those COGS are often kind of limited, certainly to the direct material, so the bandaging, the fluids, the vaccines themselves, and the direct labor. But really, as we jump from the gross margin down to the net income, there's quite a lot of other costs. There's other variable costs and there's other fixed costs that I think are not often that well accounted for in veterinary medicine. So let's dive into some examples. So I mentioned I practiced on and off for close to 10 years, was commissioned for a good chunk of that time. And even during my most recent stint of part-time practice, I was commissioned. And I would often say to myself, I made how much on that case? Now, sometimes that could have been said in exasperation, pulling my hair out, and sometimes I was pleasantly surprised. And why was that the case? Well, it's that the prices don't always capture all of the variable costs, and the biggest one we're talking about in veterinary medicine is often labor. So prices, many times they're set on benchmarks, they've been adjusted really in fixed inflationary increases for many years, and they can kind of get away from both the true cost in terms of a cost-based pricing, but they can also get quite a ways away from the value. And we'll talk about that here as well. So we really use a combination of value-based pricing and cost-based pricing in Marquis Practice Solutions. So what's a good example? This will be familiar to all of you, I think. I really didn't mind seeing a mild to moderate gastrointestinal disease case. Now, we've got some caveats here. It's going to be, say, a young adult. It's healthy. We're pretty sure it's not a toxin or a foreign body. We're pretty sure it's not Addison's or something more serious. This can be a case where it's relatively straightforward. You're making, moderately decent amount of money for the time and labor involved. and yet you're not spending a ton on it. Some fluids, some labor, of course, but that's mostly delivered by our great assistants and technicians and not the DVM. Maybe some famotidine, Serenia, ID low fat, plus or minus fecal, plus or minus blood work, have the client prepped for imaging if needed. These cases I felt, gosh, $600 to $800, maybe more in today's climate. That wasn't a bad way to make a few $100s as an associate. On the other hand, we'll all be familiar with this, me and the team wrestling an aggressive large breed dog, or perhaps worse, a fractious cat, 2, 3, 4 people involved, 5 to 10 minutes. Not fun for anybody, feces and urine everywhere, anal gland expressions, risk of injuring the pet, risk of injuring yourselves and your associates. Not great. And we pretty much can't charge enough for that. And you could ask, well, is it a loss leader and do we have to provide this service? I'm not going to dive too deep into that here and now. But one thing I'll mention is that sometimes this leads to what I call socialized veterinary medicine. And by that, what's happening is your friendly, cute little cat or your lovely little Pomeranian that's quite pleasant, they're subsidizing for the same price, the rascal that's bouncing off the walls and tearing everybody up. Because you typically, some do charge more for fractious animals, and certainly if it needs sedation or more, you will charge more. But this happens quite a bit in our industry where kind of good pets and good clients kind of subsidize not so good pets and not so good clients. And that'll always be part of the equation. But that just tells me there's pricing inefficiencies. Another example here would be, say, the difference between an ACTH STIM test and something like an unremarkable CBC chem. Now, of course, many of you will offer a slightly lower price on a wellness screening. But let's say you were screening for, say, mild inappetence or something. You're doing a CBC chem. It's probably going to come back normal, but you're doing it as good medicine. These are quite different tests, and yet we often apply the same flat markup to them, 200, 250, 300%. With the ACTH STIM test, you're describing a relatively complicated endocrinopathy that's taking some time up front, takes more time to do the test, and then it takes time to describe it afterwards, whether the patient's positive or negative, because you will also have to get into the false positive, false negative scenario with these clients. So what we try and do is look, be aware of, and help clients price appropriately. And many times we'll recommend increasing some prices and decreasing others. And that's really where our tagline, purpose-driven profit maximization, comes from. We want it to be purpose-driven. We want to fit your values, your clientele, your vision and mission. And we want it to be fair and efficient for the clients as well. So let's dive into an example here. This was one of my first contracts, really. It's actually with a shared client with Granite Peak. A $1.2 million a year, one doctor practice, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, doing quite well on the top line, or I'll say it's somewhere in the Northeast. And they came to me and they recognized, hey, vaccines generate a decent amount of our revenues and actually probably quite a lot of net income. Right? As we'll see, these are fairly high margin items. And yet it's a part of the business model that is being chipped away at by shot clinics, Vetco. So we have mobile and fixed low-cost vaccine clinics now. Some of you will have greater threats than others, but it's certainly something I think we should all be cognizant of. So I won't spend too long on this, but what this chart's showing is just I wanted to create an estimated range of sort of slightly cheap, perhaps to upper middle of the road pricing. I chose these vaccines and services here because this is a package that one of the major shot players offers. You probably wouldn't necessarily do this all at once. Perhaps a large breed, healthy, middle-aged pet that's had these shots before you might, but we're going to get into the sort of power of bundling and bundle pricing. So what we see here that most clinics, I think many of you would say this is a fair price range. Of course, many of you in the Northeast will actually be doing a 4DX or an Acuplex, not just a heartworm test, but again, just comparing apples to apples here, we had to be about $275 to $390 price to the client. How much would you keep of that? Well, given that vaccines sort of range $3 to $5 each, you're going to be keeping a fair bit of that, $194 to $312. Now, keep in mind, this is just gross margin. I'm not taking out labor or overhead, but just want to give a picture that this is a fairly high margin piece of the business. And this is exactly why companies like ShotVet and Vetco have got into the scene. And what you'll notice, I was actually surprised at this, is that their a la carte prices for vaccines are not cheap, really. They're kind of on par with many vet clinics. So how do they end up being a competitive threat? Well, this is one big one, is that they don't charge an exam fee. And they do that because they don't have the overheads. They're in, Tractor Supply's parking lot. They also do a much briefer exam, and so they don't have the same cost structure that you do. So right away, even a la carte, the clients are paying, $30 to $50 less, maybe even a little bigger savings. But where they really become a threat is when they offer packages. And what they do here is say, if you do all of this, we're essentially going to give you one or two items for free. Not only a free exam, we're going to give you a free shot. And I think it's better to do it that way, have fairly high a la carte pricing, but then discount a vaccine altogether. So should you consider bundle pricing? I would say I think you should if you're seeing clients come in with their receipts from one of these clinics. They're updating the charts. And look, don't blame them. I've had a previous boss that used to. I think, look, this is the way the world works. They've seen an opportunity. They're cutting in on it. What can we do to counter it? And should we counter it? So one idea is I think bundling low-cost vaccines, well, most of them are fairly low cost, with your core vaccines, but offer the non-cores. This is a way to increase what you would call penetration or acceptance of non-core vaccine recommendations. I would typically start out only offering it to pets that are not up to date or have never had these vaccines. So you're getting new or possibly long-lapsed pets these vaccines. What are the benefits? Well, of course, you're going to increase your patient's protection against infectious diseases. Would only do it if it's medically indicated. I'm sure that's the way you all practice anyway. But what you're doing is you're creating a recurring value stream. You may want to even discount the booster shot, but then a certain number, probably a good number of these clients, will continue to get this over time. Now you need to convey that, look, this bundle package is just offered for lapsed or new patients who are new to these non-core vaccines. But I think it's a way to strategically start fighting back against these business models. As I said before, try and preserve the value of vaccines. Don't discount their list price, but rather give one away as part of a bundle and make it clear that you're doing that both to help the pet. It is a one-off and that it will afford their pet more protection. So what else can we do on the vaccine front? No surprises here. We can consider offer vaccine clinics in your own clinic. Now, I think this was particularly pertinent during the height of the pandemic because what was happening, and I was practicing then, I only stopped practicing part-time a year ago, is that we were so full you couldn't get people in. And yet you may have an entire appointment that's just a couple of booster shots in an outwardly healthy pet. And even if you're not that busy, it may still make sense with certain parameters. So you would want the patient to be healthy, maybe cap it between 2 and 7 years of age to avoid chronic problems. I would recommend limiting it to boosters for up-to-date animals. You'd want to minimize the risk of anaphylaxis and minimize the risk of having to discuss the pros and cons of new vaccines. CSRs need to make it clear to these people that the pets have to be healthy. They will not be receiving medical advice. They will get a limited exam to make sure the pet is safe for the vaccine. But that is about it. And how can you run this? Well, you can either reduce or eliminate the exam fee, and you may choose to combine it with bundling or not. When should you do it? Well, you know how busy you are better than Google Maps does, but Google Maps is a handy way to look at how busy businesses are and when they're busy. This particular clinic is surprisingly quiet on a Monday morning. They're busier on a Tuesday morning. The dotted line is about as busy as that clinic ever gets, or that business under Google Maps. And what we'll see is I'd probably consider planting it on Monday morning if I had all my staff there. I probably would not do it Tuesday afternoon and evening, and certainly there'll be other busier days and times where you wouldn't want to do this. Yet another strategy, and some of you I'm sure are doing this already, is could and should my licensed vet techs be administering some vaccines? Again, we want caveats. Start with the last point first. It's extremely important that the clients and the tech know to practice within the scope of the Technicians Practice Act in your state. Check with your VMA or state board if you need to. In most states, they can administer most vaccines other than rabies. And this could be done either as part of a vaccine clinic or have a regularly scheduled half a day, once or twice a week or more. It can be very rewarding and fulfilling for the technicians. You're allowing them to do more with their license, to be more active, and some of them at least will like interacting with clients and having that role. but it is, of course, very important to make sure they don't go beyond the scope of practice. Final point here, a little bit of a soapbox, so I apologize in advance, but and this was very pertinent during the pandemic, but may still be pertinent, is that I would say it's possibly a false economy to use one-year rabies vaccines to sort of force cat owners in once a year. I've had people so much as admit that. I know it's not the only reason. Some people might argue there's a lower risk of sarcomas. However, I think with a 3-year PureVax, you're really not going to be far off the one-year product. And so what's happening is you're probably hampering public health efforts by only giving the animal a one-year vaccine, but you're also displacing potentially higher average transaction visits, right? So the cat's coming in, exam, rabies. They're out of there, $110, $150. You could have had a puppy, you could have had a sick pet. Just important to keep in mind. I'll make it very clear, I think annual and biannual exams are, of course, the best medicine. I'm really more of a cat guy than a dog guy, full disclosure, so I don't want to see cats on the outer, but just keep that in mind. And there are other kind of false economies like this in our profession. So here's another example from the field, from a shared client with Granite Peak, and this one came to me. In this case, I went to them and said, hey, Doc, your sub-Q fluids are leaking. A little corny, I know. I'm not saying you're losing that fluid from the 18 gauge use on a kitten. I'm saying your profits are really not where they should be or where you think they are. And this is where, as boring as accounting can be sometimes, this is where diving into the numbers can be very, very beneficial. So this is undoubtedly fairly cheap for fluids. I'm sure many of you are above this, but some of you might be around there. And look, the direct materials, the bag of fluids, the line and the needles are fairly cheap. So you think at first glance, oh, I'm making $20, not bad. But let's think about the labor that goes into it. Now, it could be as little as 5 minutes, but it's often 2 people. Could be the vet and the tech and an assistant. You may rope a client into it. You do, of course, have to pay the commission. It's not technically direct labor. That's the cost of sales, but let's leave it in here for now. So all of a sudden, you're left with $9.50 from the 25. Not bad, 38% gross margin, not too bad. But really, what are other costs? Well, we need to pay the mortgage or the rent. We need to pay insurance, taxes, many other costs that really need to be ascribed to each and every service that we offer on a prorated basis. And that's not cheap, as you all know. Our costs, labor and then other overheads are a significant portion of our costs. So when we added this in, this client was only making $2 on a good day. If it was a fractious animal, if you needed to give a full liter, you're actually losing money on the fluids. So let's say they're doing $150 a year, grossing $37.50. Their margin was $14.25 gross margin. But what was their net income or the net margin? Just $300 plus or minus. So this is, purpose driven. We said, why don't we tier it, right? The smaller pets are subsidizing many times the larger pets. Not always. You may have some fractious cats in here that are just as hard or harder than a big lab, but squeezing that liter bag, we've all been there, can take quite a while. So what we did is you're going to have generally slightly higher material costs, higher labor costs, and it also offers great value. So that's the cost-based pricing, right? This is setting a price floor. But what's the value? Well, sub-Q fluids bring a ton of value because you're often trying to keep a patient out of hospital. And this is chump change compared to hospitalizing a pet. Even if you keep them out for a few hours or a few days, you save the clients hundreds to thousands of dollars. And so, yes, we went up 50% to 100%. And this client of mine was very cognizant. They purchased a few years ago a high volume, high quality, but moderate to low cost practice. Be careful not to change that dynamic too much, but it is a bit of a recipe for burnout. You can't be that good at that high of a volume at these low of a prices and be sustainable for too long. So have a look at, hypothetically, right, we're assuming we keep this 50 in each weight category and that we keep all 150 a year. This revenue goes up by more than 10x, right? Pure bottom line, pure profit goes from 300 to 4,100. Now you may lose some of these clients. I don't think you'll lose a ton. But you can lose a heck of a lot to bring this 4,100 down to 300. So this is kind of work we do at Marquis Practice Solutions, line by line, and more recently, drug by drug, focusing on really leaking profits, right? You think you're doing okay, doesn't look too bad, looks a little worse. Oh gosh, wow, we've only made $2. Here, just touched on a lot of this already, but let's look a little more closely. What are your costs here in the direct labor it's not just the hourly rate you pay your technician, it's their paid time off, their CE, their health insurance, associated payroll taxes, FICA taxes, and so on. In those indirect labor costs, we're talking about the manager's time and the CSR's time. Obviously, it's nominal for this patient, but it does have to be paid. And other expenses, very high ones, real estate costs, well worth the accounting and tax advice, of course. Legal costs, merchant fees can be huge, as you all know. They all have to be paid for. And if we fail to capture them and fail to apportion them appropriately to our goods and services, there's sort of a big black box. So I'm going to finish up here with an example on drug pricing. Right, we've been doing a lot of this lately, and there's an awful lot of low-hanging fruit here. Just a couple more slides, and we'll be able to jump into questions. So this quote comes from one of my early clients, and it's really in reference to Chewy. And hey, you guys, I'm saying your price is a little high. We may want to compete with them a little bit strategically, and we don't want to race them to the bottom, was the response. And I get that. It's very, very hard to compete with a multi-billion-dollar business who is running a loss-making operation. You know, Amazon has done that to many industries for many years. But what are the risks of not doing this? Well, we worry that having high markups and or dispensing fees on particularly certain products can lead to an erosion of trust as clients go on to discover that they can find these products online for 20, 30, or 50% less. And many of you are well aware of this and are targeting at least a few key items. We think it applies across the board and warrants really a line-by-line examination of all of your prescription drug pricing and ultimately all of your services. So why would I recommend lowering some prices? It's first of all to avoid that loss of goodwill, because some of these clients, when they realize it, you'll never get another script again from them, that's for sure, or you'll be writing handwritten scripts, you won't be selling them. But also you may lose them altogether. They can be that disengendered, as we'll see on the next slide, that they just leave. And the other thing is, and this can take some nuance, that if you get the price right, you can have a higher volume and you can make up for a lower price with a higher volume and keep the same amount of income at the end of the day and have happier clients and often happier staff. So let's look at an example here. I'm not going to name the drug, you might be able to guess it, but we have 3 clinics here. These are all similar clinics, let's say 1.5 to 2 doctor clinics grossing roughly 1.5 million, similar demographics, different geographies, same drug. And look at this dispensing fees go from $6.14 to nearly $28. So it's sort of a doubling and almost another increase by a third again. We see the same is happening with their unit prices. And this is quite worrisome to have a large dispensing fee and a high unit price, because as you get up into higher quantities, you get very high prices. So this is the price of this drug for Clinic A. It's actually cheaper than Chewy. Now, free tip, you should probably never be cheaper than Chewy, but they were accidentally, I think, $9 cheaper or 11% cheaper. Well, how did it work out? They sold a lot of units. They sold the most units and they had the most transactions. They had the second most total revenue. They had the worst gross margin dollars, right? But not by much. And we'll talk about this more in a second. But they were the cheapest. They were making the least on each transaction. Clinic B, I think, is closer to the pin. I think they're still perhaps a little too high on this drug, right? No surprise, this is a chronic drug. So when you're $32 a month more, you know, you're getting close to $700 a year more. You know, sorry, $600 in this case, $700 here. You're going to really upset your clients over time. They lost some units and they lost some transactions. Now, again, these are not the same clinic. We really can't make that direct comparison. But is it possible that this difference is attributable to the price? I think it certainly could be. And when I saw this third clinic, I was really convinced that that was the case. You know, charging almost twice as much as the online competitor. Very handsome profits, very handsome gross margin, but is it sustainable? It doesn't seem like it. You can end up losing your entire pharmacy doing this, or a big chunk of it. So sales units way down, lower transactions. Now, you know, we are talking only gross margin. So these guys are probably doing better on a net margin. They have less labor pulling the pills off, counting them, labeling them, doing the transactions. But, you know, and some people are advocating let it go. You know, let certain chunks of it go. I don't think that's entirely wrong, but you certainly want to think about it. And can you strategically compete? And I think the sweet spot is somewhere in here. And I know you can. I've had clients make, you know, ROIs on my consulting fees of 500 to 1,000% in the first year, by implementing these types of changes on a line-by-line item. But it's to be done ethically. It's to be done in a manner where you're not gouging your clients, but you're conscious of the pros and cons, the value to the patient, the value to the client, the shoppability, the ease of getting it from somewhere else, the cost of waiting. So lots of really cool stuff to dig into here if you're a bit of a nerd like me. Looks like we've gone over the half hour, so I'm going to wind it up now. Plenty more. I could probably talk all day, but here's just a final tagline: the purpose-driven profit maximization. We do it by optimizing our clients' pricing while honoring their vision. And we do that by both recommending increase and decreasing. Interestingly enough, the same drug may sometimes go up on one end and down on the other end of the spectrum in terms of quantity dispensed. So thanks so much for your time. Alex, you care to jump in? Do you have any questions I can address?
Ask if they can leave questions in the chat box. That's a great place for them. Or if anyone wants to come off mute, you can do that as well. And actually, it looks like we have our first question there in the chat.
Okay. Let me dig through it here. Come in quite quietly, Alex. I may have to, let's see. Approximately. Okay, so we've been administering liberal since it hit the market. We followed Zoetis's suggested pricing, $30 over cost. We charge the same price plus an appointment fee each month. How do you suggest we make sure we're pricing this correctly? Well, it's a very good point, and I find it interesting that manufacturer suggested pricing. I think with these types of things, these are I have what I call a pricing power index, and basically it's part of what we offer is certain products have more pricing power than others, right? A good example would be, say, timolol. The animal needs its glaucoma treated ASAP, and you have a fair bit of pricing power. Now, you certainly don't want to gouge them, and they will get on it chronically, so they'll find out what the real cost is eventually. But there in the moment, you can be possibly twice the cost of the competitor. Another thing to keep in mind is that percentages are different to dollar amounts. So you can be above the competition by quite a big percentage amount, but if it's $5, $10, $15 in today's market, a couple of gallons of gas, that will be better stomached than being above them by $70, $100 or more. So, I'm not sure that I can answer this here without knowing all of your context, but I think, the question here would be that cost can be quite high, especially charging the appointment. So if you are comfortable having a technician administer it, for example, consider doing that. It can be more rewarding for the technician, interacting with clients, using their skill set to a fuller capacity, and either have a reduced cost or a no cost. It's important to make that work with your flow, so you're not pulling your one tech, off the floor to do this kind of thing. Block them, staff appropriately. I'd love to help more on that one, but I'd need a little more knowledge of your cost structure and pricing structure. I don't think it's wrong to start with their recommendations, and I think injections are a bit of a special case. Some clients will do it. We've seen that over the years with certain drugs. I've even had some clients request Cytopoint, for example, when I was practicing. And they will do it. And so there is a somewhat of a threat from online competitors, but it's nowhere near as high for injection drugs. So you do have pricing power there. Yes, so can I comment on the value of setting prices much closer to Chewy? I think you should. There's a big caveat to that, is you should be thoughtful about it. Which drugs, in which settings. I will say many people understand full well that they need to be closer for flea and tick and heartworm medication. And I think that makes a ton of sense. I mean, part of the genesis for this business of mine was practicing not that long ago and feeling bad as an associate when my client bought a 12-pack of these meds knowing they just paid $50, $60, $70 more than they could have online. And one of my LinkedIn posts is a picture, sort of 1800s sketch of two women talking to each other, and they're whispering, hey, don't tell management, but you can get this cheaper online. We have this risk of your staff, many of whom empathize with the clients, many of whom are not making huge amounts of money. When they realize that disparity, they're going to be sort of sending some of your clients to the competition. So one of the purpose-driven part of our pricing methodology is that we want you to be able to explain to the client, look, we retained a consultant. They went through this, top to bottom. We have to pay you. We have to keep the lights on. we have bought some things down. Emphasize the things you bought down. I also recommend to my clients when they do have a windfall, please try and pass some of that on to your clients. So that's one thing. We have a question here about vaccine visits with a tech, not a doctor. Should you consider a tech charge? Excellent point. I think it depends on how much competition you have from the shot clinic. Some of you will have practically none, and that's quite good. Some of you may have quite a lot. They're popping up at Walmart, Walgreens, and Costco, and Tractor Supply, and they may even have a fixed location near you. So there you have to be strategic, right? And also there's a thing in retail, we talk about cannibalization. You don't want to cannibalize your own services, so you do have to be strategic about this. But I think you have some good guardrails around it. The patient has to be up to date, whether that's once a year or twice a year, depending on your own requirements. It really should be a healthy pet, and I think it should be an adult, really 1 to 7 or 8 years, depending on the breed, because we all know those wellness, 14.5-year-old labs is not a wellness exam. And so time is money in veterinary medicine. Being able to do more with less time and do it well and appropriately is important. So should you charge a tech visit? I think it depends an awful lot on the competition. It should be cheaper for the client. It should at least probably be half or less, maybe a quarter of the DVM fee. It depends if you're bundling or not too. If you're bundling, you may not need, you can then possibly charge a tech exam fee. So great question. Really, seeing that you guys are giving us a lot of thought. And so, and also you can change your mind, so think about the market, think about, your demand, your supply of labor, your availability of appointments, things. I'm seeing things kind of come down. So there seems to be more white space on calendars. So does it make sense to have a tech do it or not? It really depends on, we want to be at the highest and best use of everybody's time. And that really is the doctor, the tech, the assistants, the receptionist, everybody. I had a great assistant when I was at a VCA. When we had quiet days, they would call, and get clients back to take advantage of the wellness plan. Hey, your blood work's still open. It's going to expire in the next month or two. Please come and get your wellness screening. Your dental, we'd hate for you to lose it. This was good for me as a commissioned associate. It was good for the clinic, and it was good for the client. And just, try not to stray too much into operations, but that sort of thing can tie in pricing and operations. So that seems to be all of the questions. I hope it's hard on the fly to give you really thorough answers. I think, to recap, with the injections, you have more pricing power. It wouldn't hurt to start with the manufacturer's recommendations. Be cognizant of the cost of that exam fee. Consider a tech exam. Consider a low cost or no cost exam. And I would do this with Cytopoint. Hey, if you come in, if you see me, if there's no other problems, and especially with Cytopoint, if you do it before the A to B flares up, I won't charge you an exam fee. Incentivize them. It's a great income stream, but you don't want them to stop doing it or go somewhere else. I do, again, pricing closer to Chewy, absolutely, with a big caveat, and one we can discuss further at a later date. But yes, and especially for frequently shopped drugs and vaccine visits. Again, to recap, text as much as you're comfortable, and yes, at a price should be less than half of the DVM fee, or potentially free, depending on your local market. So with that, I'll turn it back to Jared to thank everybody for joining us.
No, I can't thank you enough, Simon and Alex, for joining us today. For the clients, jumping on board here. Like I said, we're going to be hosting these every month on Fridays, first and second Friday of every month. So we'll be sure to distribute this video if everyone wants to reference back to it, share Simon's information. And thank you all again. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.